They first appeared out of the hedgerows with a speed and coordination that stunned the American infantrymen advancing through Normandy in the summer of 1944. These were not ordinary German riflemen fighting from fixed trenches or improvised foxholes. These were Panzergrenadiers, motorized assault troops moving in SDKFZ 251 half-tracks that growled forward like steel-bodied predators. For many Americans, it was the first time they had seen enemy infantry arrive mounted, dismount in seconds, and immediately unleash a storm of MG-42 fire so intense it felt as if the air itself had been shredded. The U.S. Army, built around foot infantry and Shermans that relied on careful coordination, suddenly faced a foe who could choose the time and place of engagement with frightening freedom. In the bocage, the terrain already favored defenders, yet the Panzergrenadiers made it worse. They did not defend passively. They moved, they probed, they counterattacked with precision. A half-track would burst from a narrow lane, skid to a stop behind the cover of a farmhouse wall, and its squad would spill out, 2 MG-42 teams, riflemen with Panzerfaust, a squad leader barking orders while the vehicle's mounted machine gun kept American heads down. To U.S. infantrymen accustomed to fighting Germans who stayed rooted in their foxholes, this was something entirely different. German mobility hit them with shock force. One moment the line appeared stable, the next it buckled under the weight of an assault executed faster than American platoon leaders could react. Companies in the 30th and 4th Infantry Divisions reported being pinned by fire before they even knew the Germans had arrived in strength. The SDKFZ 251 half-track was the heart of it all. Not a tank, not a truck, but something in between, a troop carrier armored just enough to survive small arms fire and agile enough to surge through gaps in the terrain. American soldiers described them as rolling gun platforms, their open tops allowing gunners to rake hedgerows while the vehicle screeched to a halt. The Panzergrenadiers inside understood their machine intimately. They used it to approach swiftly, using its armor to close distance, then abandoned it the instant they reached ideal firing range. The half-track withdrew a few meters to safety, while the squad advanced under its covering fire. For the Americans, the experience was disorienting. German infantry seemed to be in two places at once, charging forward while still being supported by their vehicle's gun. In the chaos of Normandy's tight fields, American squads often found themselves reacting seconds too late. A platoon would move through a gap only to be struck on the flank by a Panzergrenadier squad that had repositioned faster than anyone could report. Fire discipline was immaculate. MG-42s delivered bursts with terrifying precision, while 81mm mortars landed within moments of contact. Panzergrenadiers did not fight as individuals. They fought as a machine whose parts moved seamlessly. And that machine overwhelmed the slower, more methodical American formations. The U.S. Army had firepower on paper, Garands, BARs, Shermans, mortars. But firepower meant little when the enemy got to choose the angle and timing of every engagement. Officers discovered that their squads were being outmaneuvered even when they held superior numbers. Reports from battalion commanders spoke of German units that closed the range before we could deploy and shifted their entire force onto one flank within minutes. Panzergrenadiers would hammer the front with suppressive fire while half-tracks looped through lanes and trails to land troops behind American positions. In Lorraine, as the U.S. Third Army advanced eastward, the problem only grew. Open ground made German mobility even more dangerous. Half-tracks roared across fields in coordinated waves, dropping squads who immediately dug in or launched localized counterattacks. The Germans seemed able to appear anywhere, to create a fight where none existed moments earlier. And most alarming of all was what the Americans discovered once they finally halted a Panzergrenadier assault. The Germans carried more automatic weapons per squad, more grenades, and were trained to maintain fire and movement with a fluidity the Americans had not yet mastered. In these early encounters, the American infantry understood a hard truth. They were being outrun, outgunned at the squad level, and outmaneuvered tactically. The Germans were using their half-tracks not as transports, but as shock multipliers. They chose when to fight and when to break contact. They delivered more fire in the first 30 seconds of combat than some American platoons could deliver in a full minute. The lesson came hard and fast. If the U.S. Army wanted to survive fighting Panzergrenadiers, let alone defeat them, it would have to change the way it moved, the way it attacked, the way it armed its squads. In Normandy, the Americans had met a new kind of enemy, and they had learned painfully that the battlefield itself now belonged to the most mobile force on it. The first thing American soldiers learned after surviving a Panzergrenadier assault was that the Germans never attacked with just infantry, and they never attacked from only one direction. A Panzergrenadier company moved like a single organism. Half-tracks, machine guns, mortars, and anti-tank teams all woven together so tightly that the Americans often mistook a single coordinated assault for multiple units striking at once. Fire and movement was not a tactic to them, it was instinct, and it was devastating. The SD Kafset 251 was the centerpiece. More than a transport, it was a mobile firing platform that delivered shock at speed. Its armored nose deflected rifle fire, its open top allowed the gunner to engage targets instantly, and its mobility let German squads choose precisely where to strike. When a half-track crested a rise or burst from a hedgerow, its MG-42 sprayed a fan of fire wider and denser than anything in the American arsenal. The gun's terrifying rate of fire, over 1,200 rounds per minute, split U.S. platoons before officers could shout orders. Then, while American infantry hugged the earth, Panzergrenadiers dismounted in tight, disciplined pairs and bounded forward, one element firing while the other advanced. The Americans could not outpace them. They could barely keep up. At St. Lo, an infantry captain reported that the Germans closed 150 yards in less than a minute while firing the whole way. In Lorraine, the problem became worse. The terrain opened, giving the half-tracks even more room to maneuver. Panzergrenadiers did not attack in a straight line. They attacked in arcs, curling around American positions so that U.S. troops faced fire from 3 sides before they had even finished deploying. A rifle squad defending a hedgerow might suddenly find itself flanked by a half-track that had accelerated across a field no one thought was trafficable. By the time the squad leader realized the threat, the Germans were already dismounted and firing. Mortar teams added another layer. German 81mm mortars were fast, accurate, and integrated directly into company-level communications. The moment a Panzergrenadier squad made contact, a mortar section, already pre-registered on likely American positions, sent rounds crashing down within 30 seconds. U.S. commanders were stunned at how quickly German support fire arrived. In after-action interviews, soldiers repeatedly recalled the same sequence: MG-42, mortar, flanking fire, then the sudden appearance of the half-track silhouette moving into a new firing angle. American forces had no equivalent responsiveness. Their 60mm mortars were excellent, but they required setup time and careful sighting. Their machine guns had slower rates of fire, lower portability, and lacked the brutal suppression that an MG-42 squad could generate. Worse still, U.S. infantry formations, trained for linear, methodical advances, were too spread out to react cohesively. A platoon stretched across a long hedgerow might find its left flank pinned, its right flank isolated, and its center forced backward by half-tracks circling like wolves around a herd. German fire came too fast, too heavy, and too coordinated. The Americans were still fighting piece by piece. The Germans were fighting as a single system. The Americans' anti-armor capabilities made the situation even more precarious. Bazooka teams rushed forward, but the older M1 and M1A1 launchers frequently failed to penetrate the angled plates of half-tracks or the frontal armor of supporting Panthers. Soldiers often watched their rockets bounce or detonate without effect. In the chaos of a Panzergrenadier assault, smoke, dust, rapid movement, bazooka teams rarely had time to close the distance enough to ensure a kill. Some companies found themselves outrun by their own weapons limitations. The Germans also understood how to break American cohesion psychologically. The thunder of a half-track engine signaled an attack before U.S. troops knew from where. MG-42 bursts carved through foliage so quickly that many soldiers thought 2 or 3 guns were firing when it was only 1. Mortars followed within moments, landing with a rhythm so precisely timed it felt mechanical, inevitable. Even veteran U.S. units like the 29th Infantry Division reported moments where entire platoons were pushed back simply because they couldn't identify the direction of the threat. It was not fear, it was blindness. Panzergrenadiers exploited that blindness mercilessly. When an American unit pulled back to regroup, half-tracks surged forward to cut them off. When a Sherman arrived to stabilize a sector, German Panzerschreck teams, cooperating closely with their mechanized infantry, appeared at the edges of fields or behind stone walls to fire at 80 or 90 meters. The Sherman was tough, but it was not invincible, and German infantry knew exactly how to support their armor with layered fire. By September 1944, American field commanders understood the scale of the problem. They were not simply outnumbered or outgunned in certain engagements, they were being out-coordinated. Panzergrenadiers fought as a unified machine, and that machine shattered American formations that were too slow to concentrate fire, too rigid in movement, and inadequately equipped to meet mechanized threats at squad level. The U.S. Army had run into the future of infantry warfare and discovered, painfully, that it was a decade behind. It would take new weapons, new formations, and a new philosophy of movement before the Americans could stand toe-to-toe with the German mechanized infantry who had mastered the art of synchronized violence. By the autumn of 1944, American infantry battalions confronting Panzergrenadiers could no longer avoid the truth staring at them from every shattered hedgerow and burned-out farm lane. They were outmatched at the squad level, not because they lacked courage or manpower, but because their weapons were simply not built for the kind of fight the Germans were forcing onto them. The U.S. Army entered France with weapons designed for a war of rifle teams and tank duels, not a war of rapid mechanized infantry thrusts supported by half-tracks, heavy automatic fire, and close-range anti-tank ambushes. And as the battles moved from bocage to open country to the dark forests of Lorraine and Hürtgen, the inadequacy of American infantry firepower became impossible to ignore. The weakness revealed itself most brutally in the bazooka teams. The older M1 and M1A1 bazookas, carried proudly ashore on D-Day, had performed acceptably against thin-skinned vehicles or static bunkers. But against the angled armor of a half-track at even moderate range, and certainly against Panthers or the frontal arc of Stug 3 assault guns, they were nearly useless. Rocket after rocket struck German vehicles only to detonate harmlessly or bounce off, the white flash followed by a sinking feeling in the stomachs of the Americans, who now knew the enemy vehicle would survive long enough to deploy its squad. At St. Lo, a bazooka gunner from the 35th Division recalled firing twice at an oncoming half-track, only to watch it skid sideways into a new firing position and unleash an MG-42 burst that pinned his entire platoon. It wasn't fear, he wrote later, it was the realization that our weapons weren't made for them. Even more humiliating was the fact that the Germans' own infantry anti-tank weapons, Panzerfausts and Panzerschrecks, were dramatically more effective. American Sherman crews, advancing to stabilize sectors under Panzergrenadier attack, found themselves trading shots with infantrymen firing weapons accurate to 80 to 150 meters and capable of punching clean through a Sherman's glacis. Meanwhile, American bazooka men had to close to 30 or 40 meters just to have a hope of a kill, often suicidal when MG-42s were already sweeping the approaches. Then came the collapse of the pre-war American anti-tank doctrine. For years, officers had insisted that the lightweight 37mm M3 anti-tank gun would be sufficient for infantry support. Normandy erased that fantasy. Against half-tracks, it lacked stopping power. Against Panthers, it was useless. Even the arrival of the 57mm M1 gun, a licensed copy of the British 6-pounder, did not fully solve the problem at first. The Americans lacked doctrine for employing it aggressively. German Panzergrenadiers, on the other hand, fought with anti-tank guns integrated into their assault rhythm. Pak-40s fired from covered defiles, half-tracks flanked, infantry pressed forward in bounds. The 57mm M1 gave American platoons and companies a fighting chance, but the Army had not yet learned how to deploy the guns quickly, camouflage them effectively, or use them to shape enemy attacks. Worse still, American infantry formations themselves were not built for the kind of overwhelming, flexible, short-range fire that Panzergrenadiers routinely unleashed. A U.S. rifle squad centered on the Garand, a semi-automatic rifle excellent for marksmanship but limited in sustained suppression. The squad carried only a single BAR, whose lower rate of fire and smaller magazine could not rival the MG-42's devastating output. Panzergrenadier squads often carried 2 MG-42s, sometimes 3. Their doctrine revolved around the machine gun. The riflemen existed to support it. In contrast, American riflemen were the backbone of the squad, and the BAR provided only moderate automatic fire. This mismatch shaped the battle at every level. In firefights that lasted less than 30 seconds, most of them did, the side with the heaviest immediate suppression won. That was almost always the Germans. American platoons frequently reported being pinned before the fight even began. Panzergrenadiers dismounted firing. Americans dismounted under fire. To make matters worse, German mechanized infantry fought with a confidence American troops rarely saw from conventional Wehrmacht formations. The half-track gave them mobility, the MG-42 gave them dominance, the Panzerfaust gave them teeth. American companies often felt as if they were fighting not 20 men, but the focused firepower of an entire battalion. And while Sherman tanks could, and often did, tip the scales back in the Americans' favor, tanks were not always present. Many battles were fought in forests too tight for armor, or in hedgerows too narrow to maneuver. When Panzergrenadiers struck in these environments, American infantry had little that could match their integration or speed. The lesson was brutal and undeniable. The U.S. Army had the manpower, logistics, and courage, but at the squad and platoon level, it was underpowered. And on a battlefield where moment-to-moment fire superiority determined survival, that deficiency cost lives. The Americans needed faster, more lethal, more portable weapons. They needed better anti-armor capability embedded directly into their squads. They needed formations that could react instantly, not minutes later. In short, they needed to evolve. And in the winter of 1944, with the enemy pushing them harder than ever, they finally began to do so. The winter of 1944 forced the U.S. Army to confront an uncomfortable truth. Beating Panzergrenadiers required not just bravery, not just numbers, but a transformation in how American infantry fought at every level. From the weapons they carried, to the formations they used, to the way a platoon reacted in the first 5 seconds of contact. The change began with the simplest, most urgent fix. Give every infantry unit a weapon that could actually stop a German half-track or a tank accompanying mechanized troops. That weapon appeared in the form of the M9A1 bazooka. Introduced in late 1944 and distributed widely by the Battle of the Bulge, the M9A1 answered nearly every problem that plagued its predecessor. It had a stronger warhead, better penetration, a safer electrical ignition system, and, crucially, a collapsible tube that made it easier to carry through forests and hedgerows. American soldiers who had watched their older rockets bounce off angled armor could now punch through SDKFZ 251 half-tracks, immobilize Stugs, and even destroy Panthers at close range if they struck the side armor. The psychological shift was immediate. Platoons that once hid from mechanized thrusts now formed hasty anti-armor cells, deploying the M9A1 in pairs to guarantee a kill. Bazooka men no longer had to close suicidally to 20 or 30 meters. The improved design let them engage confidently at 60 or 70. Suddenly, the Panzergrenadiers' greatest advantage, closing distance before American squads could react, was no longer guaranteed. But weapons alone were not enough. The Americans needed a backbone for their anti-armor defenses, something sturdier than a portable launcher, yet mobile enough to accompany infantry. The answer came from a British idea adopted reluctantly at first, the 57mm M1 anti-tank gun. Light, compact, deadly with the right ammunition, the 57mm quickly became indispensable against half-tracks and the armored vehicles supporting Panzergrenadier assaults. The U.S. Army had once dismissed this gun in favor of the obsolete 37mm. Now they rushed 57Ms forward, attaching them not to distant battalion reserves but directly to rifle companies, where they could engage enemy vehicles at the moment of contact. Crews trained to dig gun pits in minutes, camouflage their positions, and coordinate fire with bazooka teams. When Panzergrenadiers attempted their familiar half-track flanking arcs, they found 57mm barrels waiting for them at unexpected angles. And when the Germans tried to dismount under fire, American gun crews responded with canister shot, turning ambushes back on the ambushers. Still, the most profound adaptation happened not in supply depots or workshops, but inside the minds of infantry commanders who realized the days of broad linear advances were over. Panzergrenadiers could tear apart spread-out formations. American platoons, once trained to advance on wide fronts, now compressed their frontage and moved in triangular assault teams designed to generate instant fire superiority. Each assault element contained a bar for suppression, a bazooka team for unexpected armor threats, riflemen to flank, and a leader empowered to make split-second decisions. Gone were the delays caused by waiting for full platoon alignment. Fire and maneuver became decentralized. Squads advanced in rushes of 10 to 15 meters, never giving the Germans the stationary targets their MG-42s craved. Communications also changed. Officers demanded tighter spacing so orders could pass instantly along the line. Soldiers learned to react to the sound of a half-track engine, pivoting automatically into anti-armor drill. Bars firing to blind the gunner, riflemen spreading to avoid enfilade, bazooka teams angling for the shot. The entire platoon became a kill zone, ready to activate the moment the enemy committed. Mortar teams adjusted too. The 60mm mortar, once used primarily for harassment, became the platoon's ace against Panzergrenadiers. American crews learned to drop rounds behind half-track cover points, forcing dismounted Germans into the open where bars and garrons awaited them. Smoke missions, once reserved for large assaults, now became a standard defensive tool. Obscure the half-track, isolate the squad, divide the German fire system. Every move the Panzergrenadiers made depended on synchronization. American smoke tore their coordination apart. The transformations even touched the Sherman crews. Tank commanders realized their armor had to stay closer to infantry, not leading, not trailing, but integrated. A Sherman with foot soldiers around it became a mobile fortress against mechanized infantry. A Sherman without infantry became a funeral pyre. By late 1944, armored infantry teams drilled together, learning to identify half-track approach routes, likely MG-42 nests, and the arcs where German squads would try to dismount. They rehearsed counterthrusts. When a Panzergrenadier squad hit the right flank, the Sherman traversed left to cut off escape, while infantry shifted to envelop the point of contact. Every movement became mutual protection. The Germans had fire and movement. Now the Americans did too, but backed by more men, more guns, and a supply system the Reich could no longer match. What had begun as a desperate struggle to survive German mechanized infantry had become something very different, the birth of a new American battlefield identity. The U.S. Army was no longer reacting, it was evolving. And the Panzergrenadiers would soon discover that the force they had once overwhelmed had learned enough to turn the tide. By early 1945, the German Panzergrenadiers, once among the most feared and tactically fluid infantry forces on the Western Front, found themselves confronting an American army they no longer recognized. The timid, spread-out rifle formations of Normandy were gone. The underpowered bazooka teams were gone. The hesitation under sudden mechanized assault was gone. In their place stood a force that had rebuilt its doctrine from the ground up, one that now understood how to break the fire and movement system that defined Panzergrenadier warfare. The shift became obvious during the Ardennes counteroffensive. While the opening days of the Battle of the Bulge shocked American units, The later clashes revealed a new pattern. U.S. infantry no longer collapsed when hit by coordinated mechanized thrusts. Instead, platoons responded with rehearsed anti-armor drills, funneling half-tracks into pre-sighted kill zones covered by bazooka teams and 57mm guns. When a German mechanized column attempted to circle a U.S. position, as they had repeatedly done in Lorraine, American squads countered by collapsing inward, concentrating fire instead of spreading thin. What once caused fragmentation now triggered cohesion. At places like Rochefort, Hansfeld, and the approaches to St. Vith, U.S. rifle companies held ground not because they had superior weapons, but because they had finally learned the logic of the enemy they were fighting. The M9A1 bazooka played a central role in swinging the balance. The weapon appeared in such quantities by late 1944 that it became impossible for a Panzergrenadier commander to assume a safe avenue of approach. Half-tracks that once darted between hedgerows with impunity now faced ambushes from 70 meters away, distances that kept American teams alive and lethal. The Germans quickly realized the battlefield geometry had changed. Panzergrenadiers could no longer rely on speed to close the gap. Every dismount point, every curve in a road, every gap in a tree line might hide 2 or 3 M9A1 teams waiting patiently for a broadside shot. The mobility that once empowered German mechanized infantry now betrayed them. Being first into the fight meant being first into American crosshairs. The 57mm M1 anti-tank gun, once underutilized, now anchored defensive lines. American commanders learned to emplace these guns in mutually supporting pairs, concealed behind haystacks, stone walls, or shallow pit berms. Instead of reacting to German half-tracks, the guns anticipated them. When a Panzergrenadier platoon attempted to advance under MG-42 suppression, a 57mm round would smash into the vehicle, forcing the infantry to dismount prematurely and under terrible conditions. Suddenly, the Germans were fighting on American terms, without mobility, without prepared positions, without the synchronized momentum that defined their doctrine. Fire superiority shifted next. At squad level, the Americans compensated for the bar's lower rate of fire by reorganizing their platoons, increasing automatic rifle distribution, and employing crossfire techniques learned the hard way in Hurtgen. Infantry commanders drilled their men relentlessly. One team suppressed, one maneuvered, one hunted the MG-42. And once the MG-42 was silent, even for 5 seconds, the Panzergrenadier squad lost its engine of domination. The U.S. Army had learned the central truth of German mechanized infantry: kill the machine gun and everything else collapses. This new understanding transformed the battlefield. German mortar teams, once terrifyingly fast, found themselves blinded or broken by American counterfire. Sherman tanks, now synchronized with infantry, denied German squads the safe flanking routes they once exploited. Riflemen no longer fired blindly into hedgerows, they fired into patterns, anticipating where German teams would bound next. And it worked. In the Saar-Moselle triangle, Panzergrenadier units attempting textbook mechanized counterattacks found their half-tracks burning on approach. In the push toward the Rhine, German squads that once dismounted cleanly under suppressive fire now found themselves diving for cover under overlapping fields of American fire. Even veteran formations like the Panzer Lehr remnants admitted in post-war accounts that the Americans adapted faster than expected and that mechanized shock could no longer break them. The turning point came not from superior technology, but from superior integration. American infantry, artillery, armor, and engineers now operated with a rhythm as cohesive as the Panzergrenadiers once had. A mechanized thrust that might have fractured a U.S. battalion in Normandy was now met with layered defenses: smoke to blind the half-tracks, bazookas to break them, 57mm guns to anchor the line, BARs to suppress dismounted squads, and Shermans to counterpunch. By March 1945, Panzergrenadiers were no longer predators, they were survivors. They fought with determination, but their doctrine had lost its advantage. The Americans had learned too much, adapted too deeply, and armed too well. What began in Normandy as a series of painful defeats ended in the Rhineland as a quiet acknowledgement across German ranks: the U.S. Army had mastered the modern battlefield. The hard lesson America learned from the Panzergrenadiers did not just help them survive, it helped them win. And when U.S. forces finally crossed the Rhine, They did so as a mechanized, coordinated, and fiercely adaptive army, one shaped, in no small part, by the very enemy that had once outpaced them at every turn.